In the deep, mean streets of Wanganui lives the biggest and baddest podcast.
Reverence Podcast with Jesse and James.
We have an international guest. We are greeted today with podcasting royalty. He is host of the Bible Study Podcast and the award-winning Amateur Traveler Podcast. 20 years of podcasting, over 2,000 episodes, and one great man of God. A guy so great they named him twice. Please welcome to the show, the one and only, Chris Christensen.
G'day, Jesse.
Hello, James.
Back at it again
You betcha.
with the Reverence Podcast with Jesse and James.
I was about to say, do we need to introduce ourselves more than once? But
I mean, I feel like people probably know who we are by now.
and repeating yourself puts the emphasis on it, doesn't it?
Yeah, like a trademark.
Stamp it twice with Chris Christensen on Reverence the Podcast with Jesse and James.
Now, he's a man who needs no introduction, but we'll give one anyway. So he's an award-winning podcaster, and he's been talking to us in the past few episodes, and for the next few. I've lost count of how many you have left, but we'll get there. Keep listening, and have a good time.
You are listening to the Reverence Podcast with Jesse and James.
I brought that up in mental health series that we did in the episode. I brought a couple of other things as well that I had actually heard from you, particularly around you did a study on Revelation.
I'm sure I heard them from somebody else. So
yeah, and I suppose that's a great thing. I think that's one big driving force for me with this podcast is us bringing Christians together and
sure,
essentially getting social media and the internet something that people can be very loud on it without having to say anything vocally. Right. It's an opportunity for us, to Christians, to match that loudness with something that's edifying, as opposed to something there, because there's a lot of nonsense on the internet. So, yeah, I've started picking that up now. But it's good. I think for me, it's very important that as a podcast that we're actually offering an alternative to all that rubbish and offering a loudness that's worth being loud. I suppose that's a thought that I was having about your podcast, that you've actually influenced a bit of we look at things and how we look at the Bible, and so we are very thankful that you're doing what you're doing.
it's the thing that keeps me going.
When I messaged you, actually, I'd actually been listening to you for a while, and at some stage I was thinking, it would be nice to talk to this guy sometime. And I was just
not that hard to get a hold of.
Well, I was at the gym one night, and I just felt a nudge, kind of like a spiritual nudge. It was sort of like, pick up your phone and go on Facebook and message Chris. And so I didn't question it, I just did it. This was before we sort of even made any solid plans of what we're going to do beyond interviewing Jack, because we're sort of going it as we go. But yeah, it was a very sort of sudden thing, engaging with you and getting to talk to us. So I really think that God really put us in a place to sort of talk to you and hopefully bring some lessons to people here in New Zealand and wherever else they listen to our podcast as well. We're currently about 90% New Zealand.
You're welcome to listen. Obviously from New Zealand, you just have to deal with that, funny American accent. That's it. No, I listen to those little nudges. So I have a list of people that I'm praying for, on a daily basis and, on a weekly basis. And occasionally when I'm praying for someone, it's like, I haven't touched base with them recently, especially people who've had loss. Probably 50 names on my list of people who, have lost parents or child or something, whatever. And just this week, I reached out to one of those and said, how you doing? And we had a great hour-long conversation. And I was really glad that I had listened to that little nudge.
That's awesome. I had a couple of questions. There was one here that I did give a warning that it was a loaded question. I think you probably know which one that is. So it was just a question with Charlie Kirk. He claims to be a Christian. and he was quite heavily into politics as well, which we understand is a very polarizing topic in the US. And as a Christian, how should we approach topics with Christians who are also heavily involved in other things like politics, but we don't necessarily want to sort of, be heavily involved in saying, I'm this or I'm that, but sort of just essentially cut through that and sort of acknowledge someone as a Christian?
So that's a hard question to know what to do, and it probably depends on the situation. I think of Paul when he writes the letter to the Corinthians. So he's writing a letter to a church that's having some problems. Like literally, they're taking the Lord's Feast, what we would call the Eucharist or communion or whatever, except they do that as a real meal at that time in the early church. And some people are going hungry and some people are getting drunk. He doesn't say, hey, what you're doing is okay, but he still greets them as brothers and sisters that need correction, he thinks, but he still accepts them as members of the family and is correcting them as members of the family. So I think that whole I can love you and disagree with you and think you're wrong is not a bad starting point. So with the Bible Study Podcast, where I'm trying not to talk about politics, and yet I think that some of the politics that I'm hearing from Christians on right and left are not consistent with some of the things I'm seeing in the Bible. It's hard because there have been a couple times that I have spoken up and I know I lost listeners, but I just felt something needed to be said. But I'm trying to, I promised originally that I'm not going to be talking about politics. But what I try and do is emphasize some of those themes that we talked about. It's like, if your Christianity is inconsistent with the fact that, when we talk about the greatest commandments, it's pretty clear. Love the Lord your God with the whole your heart, and all your mind, your strength, and love your neighbors yourself. And the Jewish scholars at the time, there was a Gamaliel, who is one of the scholars who's mentioned in Acts. I think he was the one, it was either him or Hillel, who said that basically the rest of all of the Torah, the rest of the Talmud is all commentary, if you understood that. And Jesus says something very similar when he's asked those questions, right? That all of the law is summed up in those two things. And so while you hear me keep harping on that, and I keep going back to that because that has to be the cornerstone of our faith. And anything we're doing in our lives or in our politics or whatever that's inconsistent with that, we should examine and determine whether that is me properly representing Christ.
I think that's a great answer. Thanks for that. We had a couple of quick questions as well. For young Christians who want to travel more, what would you want them to understand before they go?
Christians who want to travel more, what do I want them to understand as traveling as Christians? I'm not really sure. That's a question I hadn't really thought about much, and I did see it on your list, but I still wasn't sure. I think it is important to know that there are people who believe different things. You will encounter that in school, in life, and certainly when you travel. We can disagree without being disagreeable. I mean, that isn't necessarily going to be very helpful to just go to some place and say, you're wrong. It probably is better to spend more time listening and trying to understand where they're coming from. Now, if you're there on a missions trip, it's going to be a different answer that I'm probably not qualified to talk about how you approach that. But it's always good to start with listening and figuring out where people are. What are their fears? What are their beliefs? How does that impact their approach to life is useful to understand? Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that's a good answer or not.
That's good. I really appreciate Wes Huff's work. He was actually someone I did reach out to. We got a response because he come to New Zealand, so we didn't get there, but I really love the way he looks at having a little bit of an understanding of what their belief system is, so you can approach it more. Say if it's Islam or if it's Buddhism, actually not being afraid to look at their resources, I guess, or their core doctrine, and being able to have a dialogue based on that. And he does really approach that in a way I think is quite graceful, but at the same time you can challenge truth and obviously disagree with one another if that's where it's going to lead.
The funny thing for me is that doing the Bible study podcast and doing it as long as I have, there have definitely been times where, I get the email that says, I've come to Christ, and you were part of it. And at least one of those was quite surprising to me, because we had a student who was working at, I think it was Google for the summer, and he was living with us because we do Airbnb, and we often have summer interns because we live in Silicon Valley. So there's a lot of demand for these students to come in and work for the high-tech companies for the summer. And he was from Malaysia. So, he wasn't really familiar with Christianity. He, unbeknownst to me, we got to know him. Great kid. We enjoyed having him with us. I don't remember ever talking about, he knew what our faith was, but I don't remember having any sort of serious religious discussions with him while he lived with us. But he got to, he knew who we were, warts and all. This is us. This is how we are when you live with us, and this is, how we are, not just what we, try and pretend we are. And I got an email from him that he had started listening to the podcast after he left and had become a Christian. And we actually got invited to his wedding because he married a Christian girl. And he said, this wouldn't have happened. She wouldn't have married me if I hadn't come to faith.
Guys, if you're listening to this, it means you're listening to the Reverence Podcast with Jesse and James. Good idea to turn it up. I want to tell you guys a story, but before that, thank you for listening to Reverence the Podcast with Jesse and James. We don't have time for your story, the episode's finished. Find us on Facebook. You don't have to be in Wanganui to do that. No. You don't have to be in Wanganui to email us either. It's on the airwaves, it's the internet, it's everywhere. The World Wide Web. www. No, we don't have a website. Yeah. So, reverencethepodcast@outlook.com. No website. Stop wasting your time with all those W's. Yeah. Hey, one day. Imagine. Anyway, for now, see ya. We're finished. Catch ya. Bye.